Welcome, everybody. It's good to see you bright and early on a Friday morning. I am Michael McQuarrie. I'm the director of the Center for Work and Democracy. I think most of you are well familiar with the center, but for anybody online, the center's mission is to rebuild the voice and power of working people in the American polity and to do research and programming and teaching that supports that endeavor. As part of that, we have been engaged in a project on trying to understand the contemporary moral economy of American workers. And as part of that, we have been bringing in speakers and developing a research project, which is led by Ben Fong, Monica McDermott, Jennifer Silva, Ben Case, Ashley Cooper, and others. Dr. Zoë West received her PhD in social anthropology from the University of Oxford and is a senior researcher at the Worker Institute at Cornell University, and she is the second in our speaker series after Jennifer Silva. Her research interests include the low-wage economy, building worker power, and advancing racial, gender, and migration justice. Dr. West has more than a decade of experience delivering political education and leadership development training programs for worker and social justice organizations. She has edited and compiled the oral history collection, Nowhere to Be Home, Narratives from Survivors of Burma's Military Regime. Today she'll be presenting her talk, From Precarity to Possibility, Cultivating Worker Agency and Solidarity Through Participatory and Peer Training. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Zoë West.
Thanks so much, Michael. Thank you so much for having me here, for the invitation to be here, and I also really appreciate all the work that went into making today possible, organizing and planning today, and getting me over here from New York. So the projects that I'm going to be speaking about today are research projects I've been doing in recent years, also with colleagues. And so I also want to just acknowledge the colleagues that I've collaborated with in this research, Sanjay Pinto, Casey Wagner, and Anne-Marie Brady. And I also want to acknowledge my colleague, Ariana Schindel, who in leading and designing peer education processes, we've collaborated a lot, and I've learned a lot in our collaborations. I also want to just mention that all of the research projects that I'm speaking about today have participatory and collaborative design in the research design. And so it also is important to acknowledge the unions and the worker organizations that I collaborated with both in New York and in California in this research. So it's a long list, but just want to name them all quickly. Carroll Gardens Association, Adhikar Community Resource Center, the National Domestic Workers Alliance, Beyond Care, SEIU, USWW, United Service Workers West, the Maintenance Cooperation Trust Fund, the New York Committee for Occupational Safety and Health, Workers United New York, New Jersey Regional Joint Board, New York Healthy Nail Salon Coalition, and Mekong, New York City. And so I named them because they were all just integral in making this research happen. And you'll see that through the research. So this talk draws on research with domestic workers in New York City, nail salon workers in New York State, and janitorial workers in California. And I'm aiming to trace the sort of complex terrain that stretches from workers' experiences of precarity and marginalization to their willingness to speak out and take action. And here I just have, these are the two of the reports on the janitors in California, nail salon workers in New York State, and the report on peer education for domestic workers is coming out in March, so that is not ready yet. But these are the main projects that I'm drawing on in this talk. So I'm going to begin by exploring sort of the conditions of precarity and the impact and the toll of precarity on workers in this industry in order to understand the ways that precarity can have a silencing effect so that we can understand what are some of the particular barriers that precarious workers face to speaking out and taking action. And then I'm going to move into looking more specifically at the role of popular education and peer education in creating that pathway towards speaking out and taking action. And so I don't want to dwell too much on the conditions because probably a lot of this is familiar to folks in the room. But the three industries we're talking about, so domestic work, and specifically here I'm going to be speaking about nannies, janitorial services, and specifically janitors in California who clean corporate office buildings at night, and nail salon workers throughout New York State. So all three of these are forms or examples of low-paid service or care work. And in particular, the examples of the kinds of low-paid service and care jobs that have expanded alongside high-paying professional jobs in what Saskia Sassen talks about as global cities, right? And so we've seen that rapid expansion of the high-paying jobs and this low-paid service and care work. There are also types of jobs that are very dependent on the labor of racialized immigrant workers. And in many cases of racialized immigrant women workers, particularly in the nail salon and domestic work, although in the janitorial services, the frontline workers are increasingly women, often supervised by men. So many of the workers who are in these jobs, they've migrated from countries that are impacted by US political, military, and economic interventions, and they migrate here and are sort of shuttled into the kind of racialized and gendered hierarchy of the US class system. And as immigrant workers, they're often legally subordinated, particularly the ones who are undocumented status, into precarious, cheap labor. So the industries that we're speaking about today are also have structures that make unionization challenging, or traditional approaches to unionization challenging. And so some of the traditional approaches to lifting standards and building workers' power are less accessible to workers in these industries. So for domestic workers, the prospect of collective bargaining is complicated. There's no body of domestic worker employer associations for them to bargain with in the US currently. So their ability to raise standards depends on the law and individual negotiations with employers. For nail salon workers, you have an industry where there's a very high number of very small businesses, micro businesses. And so the enterprise-based unionization is also is less achievable, right? A lot of industries of this type, workplaces will often just shut down. Unionize, it's very hard to achieve any kind of level of union density, and workers have limited structural bargaining power. In the janitorial services in California, it's a little different because there is a unionized portion of the sector. And there's also a very large non-union portion of the sector, which is characterized more by subcontracting and a lot of layers of subcontracting, a lot of evasion of labor and employment law. And so for our research, we were partnered with both the union and their partners working with non-union workers. So, and just very quickly, as background, again, I think this is familiar to many of you, but in the US, right, we have, in low-wage industries, a lot of research has documented systematic violation of labor and employment law in low-wage industries. This is true in the industries we're talking about today. And we have quite a weak enforcement regime in the US, right? And so there's a low number of investigators, there's low capacity, under-resourced enforcement agencies, meaning that it is very complaint-based enforcement, which is relevant to our talk here today because it is very dependent on workers. The burden is on workers to come forward with complaints. There's an extremely low likelihood that a workplace will be subject to a random investigation because of the low capacity of enforcement agencies. And when we're talking about violations here, right, we have all kinds of things. Wage theft is prevalent across these industries. Hour violations. We have misclassification of workers as independent contractors instead of as employees is also very common. And as these, given these like lack of capacity, particularly in federal enforcement, we started to see an increase in recent years in state and municipal worker protection activity. So we see an increase also in unions and worker organizations advocating to pass legislation to protect the most precarious workers. This is true in the industries that we're talking about today. And we see different other things such as strategic enforcement in certain areas that aims to have a more proactive approach rather than reactive. And forms of co-enforcement, which there's like a range of formalization, but different kinds of partnerships between government enforcement agencies and worker organizations that allow workers to take more of a role in the enforcement process. But as we see this increase in kind of ways to try and fill in the enforcement gap, and as legislation has been passed protecting nail salon workers in New York State, protecting domestic workers in New York and other states through the Domestic Worker Bill of Rights, and also protecting janitorial workers in California, it has become very clear that given these profound limits of enforcement, these rights can only be made real if workers themselves are empowered to enforce those rights, right? And so today, we're going to be having this as the backdrop of precarity that these workers are kind of operating within. So as I said, I want to spend a little time before we go into thinking about this kind of bridge from precarity to speaking out. I want to spend a little time thinking about the lived experience of precarity and exclusion and the toll that it takes on workers in these industries. A toll that's physical, psychic, and social. And so I want to argue here that the toll of precarity and exclusion fosters silence for these workers, dampening their will to speak out often by constraining their sense of what's possible. And so when I say that precarity and exclusion can constrain workers' sense of what's possible, I'm grounding this in the idea, which I think if many of you if you have experience in organizing, might know this from experience, that people will only speak out or fight for things that if it seems like change is at least somewhat possible, right? And so people's notions of what's possible, their imaginings of what attainable futures exist, aren't static, of course, right? They're constantly expanding or contracting according to their material circumstances, to the discourses and actions that they're part of. And so I want to explore here the ways that experiences of precarity and marginalization can constrain workers' sense of what change is possible and create a silencing effect. And this isn't universal or inevitable, right? And we're going to be looking at the ways that change can start to feel possible for workers. But I think spending some time in order to understand the particular barriers that precarious workers face to speaking out or to taking collective action. So in our interviews and focus groups with domestic workers, nail salon workers, and janitorial workers, when we turned our attention to workers' lives outside of the workplace, we see the ways that precarity and marginalization are experienced through the pressures and the demands in the realm of social reproduction. So low wages, economic insecurity, often combine with the pressures of providing for family, both near and far, right? A lot of immigrant workers are also sending remittances to family. And it leaves workers with this acute daily struggle to afford their living costs. They're in these industries where the workers are predominantly immigrant women of color, this effect of insecurity also ripples out quite far, as these women are often shouldering the burden not only of unpaid care work for their own families, but also within their communities. And so they're navigating this constant tension between the paid work alongside the unpaid care work and the tensions of being able to manage that. And so in the research, we've had workers describe the acute psychological stress that they endure in struggling to provide for their dependents at home and sometimes in their home countries. Many women describe the pressure of being the main providers for their families or being single mothers. In our focus groups with workers, we often had workers also overcome with emotion, describing this stress of providing for their families with inadequate wages, unpredictable hours, and rising costs of living. The constraints of time and temporality, their relationship with time, and the physical exhaustion and pain that workers experience also serves to constrain their sense of what's possible. For many low-wage workers, their experience of time is marked by a lack of control and excessive demands on their time. They and their time are socially devalued. They spend hours each day commuting from their homes in more affordable neighborhoods to more centrally located workplaces. Schedules and days off that are often unpredictable and hard to plan for. Unpredictable amounts of time waiting in bureaucratic processes, and never enough hours of sleep to restore exhausted bodies. And so this leads to the physical impacts of precarity too, right? The exhausted bodies from long hours or from night shifts, as the janitors in our research work on the night shift. Health problems from the ergonomic hazards of all of these kinds of work. We also have, for the nail salon workers, particular long-term and short-term health risks they face due to the hazardous ingredients and the chemicals, the toxic chemicals they're exposed to every day in their workplace. And also things you may have heard about in other industries of workers, skipping bathroom breaks or not being able to go to the bathroom, and things like that are either because of the pressure to not lose money or because of the rushing of supervisors, which lead to physical and medical conditions for these workers as well. And more broadly, these precarious workers often lack access to paid sick leave or health insurance, further eroding their ability to care for their physical bodies. So caught between these demands of the poorly paid labor that they have in the present, the time, and the money needed to care for and provide for their families and their communities, these workers are often painfully conscious that they're dependent on this very frail thread of stability offered by their job. June Nash, in her book on Bolivian tin miners, We Eat the Mines and the Mines Eat Us, addresses an important tension in this vein. She speaks about distinguishing between workers' consciousness of exploitation in the workplace, which stems from their alienation from the rewards of one's work, and on the other hand, their consciousness of dependency, which stems from their alienation from the means of production. And Nash argues that while these two forms of alienation are often assumed to kind of fuel each other, that actually, in practice, they often clash, right? As the consciousness of dependency can understandably lead workers to search for any kind of thread of stability, right? And so in our research, we see the ways that this emerges and that workers feel the need to hold on to these threads of stability. But we also see that one of the ways that this emerges in particular is through a fear of retaliation, and particularly the fear of being fired or losing work because of speaking up. So because of all these conditions that I just described, workers feel a heightened sense of their vulnerability to the risks of retaliation. So I want to share a quote from a nail salon worker in New York City describing why workers generally stay silent in the face of widespread labor violations. So she said, "I think it's fear because we depend a lot on work. Honestly, you can't have any savings with low wages. I mean, you can't say, I'm just going to quit this job. Sometimes it takes me a whole month to pay the bills, and I can't save anything. Sometimes we feel alone and we feel like this only happens to us and no one can help us. We're afraid of retaliation in the workplace. Maybe we won't lose our job, but nothing will ever be the same. Sometimes they'll cut hours or they'll cut days from your work schedule. This is a pervasive fear among the compañeras." So for one part, this silence emerges from a sober assessment of their circumstances, right? The prospect of losing work in retaliation for speaking up can be daunting given the widespread economic security described above and their low wages. And for workers without immigration status who don't have access to social benefits and social protections, this creates even further insecurity. Many of these workers also have limited alternate options for work because of labor market segregation, language barriers, and their immigration status, so it heightens the risk of losing work. And as we know, although it's explicitly illegal for employers to fire workers because of organizing or speaking out about labor violations, it's very difficult to prove, and so the protections for workers are tenuous. So this fear of retaliation surfaced across all of these research projects, with workers having witnessed or experienced retaliation in response to speaking out or about labor violations or unfair working conditions. And I'll say they experienced either retaliation, threats of retaliation, or simply employer inaction, right? And so, for example, one janitor who our research there was focused specifically on experiences of sexual harassment and sexual violence in the janitorial industry. And one janitor described how when she did try to report harassment, she ended up having to change jobs and nothing happened to her harasser. So workers' sense of what is possible is also constrained in other ways by other factors that can serve to muddy their understanding of their rights and protections and their place in the structures of work. And so their knowledge about the rights and protections that they have, as well as the difficulty they have in accessing these. So workers may not be aware of the laws that are there to protect them. And in a lot of these industries, for example, like domestic workers have been excluded from federal protections, and only through certain legislation, the Domestic Worker Bill of Rights that's been passed at the state level, has this restored some basic protections. But in many of these, workers may not be aware that even these minimal protections apply to them. They may not know how to access them, even if they are aware of them. And employers will often obfuscate their understanding of like what protections they have and how to access them. Among immigrant workers and undocumented workers, they also might not be aware that these laws are meant to protect workers regardless of immigration status. Again, on paper versus in practice is also at play here, in that even the workers who do try to access this will often face a lot of barriers. And in these industries also, opaque and complex pay configurations can also breed confusion, making it difficult for workers to understand whether they're being paid what they're supposed to be paid, whether they're being paid what they're legally owed. So many of these factors end up giving workers a sense that they are isolated. It gives them a sense of isolation in their conditions. And for some workers, this is amplified by the physical isolation from other workers. Domestic workers obviously are working in private homes as the sole worker. The janitorial workers in our research are working in night, spread out across different corporate office buildings. And when in that case, with the janitorial workers facing high levels of workplace sexual harassment and sexual violence, they have added layers of stigma and shame and the trauma in being able to speak out about this. Really exacerbates their sense that they have to endure this on their own. So to summarize here, these are some of the ways that the lived experience of precarity can really function to constrain workers' sense that change is possible, and thus have a silencing effect on workers. And so you have here the consciousness of dependency, the fear of retaliation, the barriers workers face to understanding or having access to their rights and protection, and their sense of isolation in these conditions. And so all of these can conspire to deflate workers' sense that change is possible. And so I want to move now into exploring what are possible pathways that allow change to feel possible for precarious workers. And so today I'm focused on one particular area, which is popular and peer education as one of these pathways. And so here we're looking at training programs that draw on a Freirean approach to education, right? And so this approach that attempts to overcome traditional power dynamics in education, that sees education explicitly as a tool for social change, that aims to allow workers to be empowered to actually challenge power relations in their workplace, in their lives. And that also really encourages the linking of theory and practice through hands-on practice in these spaces. And so I'm going to be speaking today about two examples of peer and popular education. One is going to be the We Rise Nanny training program with nannies in New York, and the other is going to be a Promotora peer educator program for janitors in California. And the nail salon workers I worked with also have an education program, but because of the constraints of time, and also I've done less research on that education program, so I'm going to focus on these two examples today. So this first case study of the We Rise Nanny training program. So this is a peer education program that runs in New York City and has starting to expand to other locations. But it originated through a partnership with Cornell's Worker Institute, where I work, and worker centers in New York, including the National Domestic Workers Alliance, ADICAR, Community Resource Center, Beyond Care, and Carroll Gardens Association. And so this is run by the training department, but my colleagues in the research department, we've been engaged in a year-long evaluation of this program. So through the We Rise Nanny training, nannies become trainers who teach a series of workshops to other nannies at their home organizations. And the workshops are a range of modules that aim to lift standards in the domestic work industry through supporting professional development, as well as developing leadership among nannies and training them in workers' rights and negotiation. So you have this blend of workforce development with workers' rights training that is key to the design, and it's evident in both the modules, so modules like social emotional development of children, as well as modules of home as the workplace and negotiation. And this blend is really critical, as we'll see, as to how the training becomes effectively like a base building tool for the organizations that participate. The peer trainer model also supports a language justice approach. So the trainings currently are delivered in 3 different languages, in Spanish and English and Nepali. And so workers are able to take trainings in the language that they are comfortable in, and generally with workers that share their cultural background. And so the emerging findings, which we are in the process of analyzing right now of our year-long evaluation, show promising results for the nannies who participate in these trainings. We see that by just the midline 6 months after taking the training and through to the year, we see a statistically significant rise in workers who have negotiated with their employers for higher wages, better working conditions. We see a significant rise in the average wage, and not only in the individual conditions that workers face, but we also see a significant rise in workers who are sharing information with other domestic workers about rights, and a significant rise in the workers who are participating in organizing and advocacy. And so we see in these structures that some of the organizations also describe that the structure of the program has become such an important channel for workers to enter their organization that because of the certificate that workers get, they're attracted to the program, and it becomes their entry point to becoming involved with the organization. The other case study is in California with SEIU, USWW. And in this case, so this is the union that became famous through Justice for Janitors, right? And so there's a long history of addressing workers' experiences of precarity in this union. But after, in recent years, the union and their partner, the Maintenance Cooperation Trust Fund that works with non-unionized workers, realized that there was an issue that was not being addressed through by the union, and that was not really being addressed for workers, and that this was the prevalence of workplace sexual harassment and sexual violence that workers were facing as workers who are working in isolation at night. And as I said, often women workers being supervised by male workers. And so they set out to create this kind of multi-pronged approach to address this issue of sexual harassment and sexual violence. And this included a lot of different measures, but the one I want to focus on today is a promotora program. And so promotora programs are a peer education approach, sometimes called community health workers. And this is an approach where the community health workers or the promotoras are from the community that they're working with. And they're aiming to be a resource to their peers, to provide trainings, to connect people with resources, and to generally help address specific issues in that community. And then so in this case, we did our research with broadly about the prevalence of sexual harassment in this industry, but also specifically to understand the promotora program and the impact also in this case that it had for the women who became promotoras. And so the promotoras go through a 40-hour training in order to prepare them to educate other workers about sexual harassment and sexual violence. It has a very explicit healing-oriented and trauma-informed approach, recognizing that the vast majority of the promotoras are survivors of sexual violence themselves, and that in order for them to actually be able to take on leadership, we found that this healing approach for many of the promotoras we interviewed and did focus groups with was really critical in allowing them to step into that role. And in the fall of 2019, the role of peer educators in the industry was also formalized through legislation, in that now legislation in California requires janitorial contractors to provide training on sexual harassment that is delivered by peer educators. And so the union has actually created a center called the Abasta Center and a master's program, a maestria, where workers are trained as professional peer educators to step into that role. So what do these spaces of peer education and popular education do for precarious workers? So I want to, in this last portion, I want to really trace some of the ways that these spaces can act as a bridge for precarious workers from that space that we spoke about earlier of constrained sense of possibility and that space of the silencing effects of precarity to feeling able to speak out and take part in collective action. And so I want to introduce this concept of structures of solidarity as these structures and practices that are meant to help workers kind of prefigure collective action, embody their potential power and embody solidarity, and thus embody an expanded sense of possibility. So in instances where, in industries where unionization is more accessible or more present, an example of a structure of solidarity might be, for example, an organizing committee of a unionization campaign, right? But in these industries, I want to focus that access and the ability to step into organizing because of those conditions of precarity, I think often requires a particular kind of bridge. And so the first thing is that these kinds of programs that I've highlighted here can create a pathway to collective action and organizing for precarious workers who might not otherwise have access to that pathway. And so for the domestic workers, for example, a lot of the workers who are drawn to that peer education program are actually drawn to the fact that they're going to get a certificate, right? It's informal work where they don't have they generally don't have access to things like that. And so this feels like a way to get increased job security, to be able to have the potential to lift their standards. So they're drawn to the professional development and the certificate, but through the design of the program, which is heavily infused with the popular education approach, and also the workers' rights content and negotiation, which is woven throughout, you end up with workers being often channeled into participating in these worker centers and these worker organizations in an ongoing way, and actually leaving with one of the biggest takeaways that they have being grounded in taking action, lifting standards, being part of a collective of other workers, and having a sense that they are part of this collective. So that pathway becomes really critical, that it does blend workforce development with organizing and workers' rights. With the janitors, I also want to name that specifically as I spoke about the healing and trauma-informed orientation of the program was also really critical, that many of these workers, this was something they maybe would never expect to speak out publicly about the issues that they face, right? This is something that many of them felt they would be enduring in silence, alone. And because of the structure of the promotora training program that the promotoras go through, they found this space of healing that enabled them to begin to have a sense of themselves as being able to step into leadership, to be able to step into this through a trust-building process. And I want to say that this isn't also just about like sexual violence, that actually even workers I spoke to talked about even feeling able to speak out about wage theft for precarious workers required a trust-building process. And so these, again, these like spaces can be a kind of space where trust can be built through addressing the particular issues of these workers that then becomes a pathway to other forms of action. The other way that it can expand workers' sense of what's possible is simply by deepening their knowledge and of rights, for example, and deepening their sense of shared knowledge, right? The knowledge that they are gleaning not only from the curriculum and the trainers, but also from each other. This is something that comes up a lot in the interviews, what they are learning from being in a space, an interactive space like that. And I think the way it functions is that it really expands workers' sense of what's possible to demand, right? Workers become aware of the rights they have, and in this interactive facilitated space, they also become part of a collective that has a shared experience of exploitation or harm that they then see a way to be able to stand up against. And so for some of them, in the peer education programs, they also are seeing their peers in leadership positions. So for many of them, they also spoke about the way that seeing a domestic worker, a fellow nanny, as a trainer, or for a janitor, seeing a janitor as this trainer or promotora is also part of that expansion of a sense of what's possible, right? But one of the things that emerges also is that, for example, with the domestic workers, many of the workers talk about before the training either not knowing that negotiation was possible, not knowing that they could make demands, or even just feeling that they just had to accept whatever was offered. Right, one nanny I interviewed described what a lot of people said by saying, the me of before would have just said, okay, and I thought I just had to accept whatever they offered me. And the me now knows that I can demand more, and knows that I have value. And this was a theme that emerges a lot, right? That the workers having this sense of, by understanding that they have rights, even if they're difficult to access, but also through that collective discussions, not only being aware of the particular things that can be demanded, but also of this idea that they can have an expanded sense of what workers deserve. And this last piece, right, and this has come through in some of what I've been saying, but it also expands workers' sense of what's possible through fostering collectivity to overcome workers' sense of isolation in their conditions, right? So I described the way that these various experiences of precarity can often, workers described a way that they felt alone, and they felt this sense that they had to endure alone what they were going through. And these spaces of popular education and peer education can sort of function as spaces of participatory democracy, right? As these structures of solidarity where people are able to practice redefining their sense of meaning and redefining value together as workers, and collectively reimagining different futures and what is possible. And this nurturing a sense of solidarity, right? This is something that comes through a lot in the way the workers speak about it. And so I want to name one quote. So Jade is a trans woman from Mexico who I interviewed, who's working as a janitor. And she did not so she's in a union, but she did not originally ever plan on speaking about her experience of sexual harassment or taking action about it. And she didn't seriously consider it until her first time joining a union march. And it was the first time that she actually experienced what solidarity and collective action felt like. So she said, and I quote, I was interested in joining this program, the Precarity program, more than anything to help my community. I say that as someone who's already marginalized. And honestly, when I first started getting involved, it wasn't serious. You know, they invited me to come to a march. I thought, okay, I'll go see what this is. But once it started, I saw it was beautiful. I liked it because you could feel the energy that you're there fighting for your rights. You're fighting and they're paying attention. And then they stop harassing you in general, and the community is there and they're helping us and they're supporting us. And so this sense of moving from this sense of isolation and the way that workers experience that. Among the nannies, we also saw, as I said, this kind of a statistically significant rise in workers being involved in organizing and advocacy, and also the ways that workers talk about the importance of that collective space with other nannies, this mutual support. And that breeds a desire to take part in collective action, and that breeds this confidence and sense that they are not alone, even if they're alone in the workplace, that they're not alone when they step out and speak out. And again, just to name that with the Precarity program, that this healing-oriented and aspect of it was also really critical in this sense of overcoming a sense of isolation, and that for many workers, just learning that they have rights and then being in a space with others where they're able to, after a process of building trust, they're able to share their experience and collectively, right? This isn't sort of like an individual process of healing. They're in this collective space of healing. That this really became also critical in imagining that change is possible. So I just want to end here by saying that this is one tool, right, in a larger realm. When we think about what are the pathways towards enabling precarious workers to be able to speak out and to take action, the pathways are numerous. And today I just wanted to focus on the ways that for precarious workers in these industries, that these structures of solidarity that they experience through peer education and participatory education spaces function to expand their sense of what is possible, and can be a really critical way of addressing the very sharp power inequities that these workers face in the workplace and the broader experiences of precarity and exclusion that they face in society. Thank you. Either way, whatever, I can take questions. Sure. Thanks.
Could you flesh out a little bit more? Can you tell us a little bit more about the pedagogy and the content of the sexual harassment training?
Sure. So in that example, I was also focused more on the experience, the training that the promotoras receive to become promotoras, because there's the two levels. And so that involves training about their rights as workers and on sexual harassment, what constitutes sexual harassment, what constitutes sexual violence, which, for some workers is also a revelation to know, like, this isn't something that actually is just something I have to accept, that it's just the way things are, that actually this is not allowed. And so they go through training on rights, what sexual harassment is. The training and the pedagogical approach creates, these healing approaches that I talked about include like circles, this kind of peer support circle approach that can be a really important part of how the workers are even feeling like able to talk about these issues. They're also being trained in like how to connect workers with resources, how if a worker is facing an issue, like what is the process that they can take to be able to connect those workers to organizations, the union, other resources for being able to address what they're facing. And they're also being trained in trauma-informed approaches to supporting other workers. Now, in the Maestria program, where they're being trained to become professional peer educators that are delivering trainings, so rather than just being a resource for their peers, they're actually delivering trainings starting this year. That one is an 80-hour training where they're basically being trained in also the training content of the training that workers in janitorial contractors will receive about sexual harassment. So many of us have taken different forms of these trainings in our workplaces, right? And so they're being trained to deliver a version of that has been tailored towards workers in that industry and in that workforce. And they've worked with actually labor institutes to create a curriculum collaboratively with workers. Yes.
Okay. Sorry, my question and like my thought behind the question is a little bit long. So my question is specifically about the peer education on workplace-based collective organizing. So what specific feminist care-informed methods are devised by immigrant women workers to challenge the traditional mode of unionization? I ask this question through a transnational comparative lens because I study the history of rural migrant women's collective action in China. And in between 2010 and 2015, a lot of labor NGOs in China started to implement the mechanism of collective bargaining, but a lot of the mechanisms and practices are based on male workers' experiences. So when male workers go to have a strike and have inform their worker representative structures, they don't have to worry about the care responsibilities in the household. But when women engage in collective action, the first institutional barrier they face are family. So, and there are migrant women workers devise their own method called home visit to essentially talk to women workers' family members to say what is collective bargaining is and what kind of benefits it can have. So they provide a community safety network and the backup for migrant women to engage in collective action. So I wondered, is there are similar or approaches are devised by them?
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. Yeah, so, right, and as we spoke about those, that's a huge tension that the workers experience, right? And so I think there's a few different examples. So, during the pandemic, when we followed up with the promotoras and the janitorial workers, just to sort of see like how the experience of the pandemic was impacting their work, they also talked to us about how the Ya Basta Center was receiving hundreds of calls from women janitorial workers, not just about this kind of issue of sexual harassment, but it started to be about a lot of the issues they were facing also in the home and seeking support. And so it became a space of organizing mutual aid as well, and also providing resources for workers to address issues outside of the workplace as well. With the domestic workers in New York, so they're receiving, the trainings are facilitated through different worker organizations that I named. And so the way it works can be, there's different ways in those different organizations and neighborhoods and communities. But one layer of that with domestic workers is also, right, they're doing care labor as their paid work as well. And so the ways, it comes up very particularly in the ways that they have to navigate the tension between caring for the children that they're employed to care for and caring for their own children, and the different configurations around that. But as far as like the spaces for, that are not traditional spaces for seeding collective action, the playground or the schoolyard become those spaces where workers are sharing information. The playground is one of the main places where workers are recruiting other nannies, where they are sharing information about rights, sharing information about what workers can demand, right? And so also kind of thinking in these organizations have learned to, with the workers, to think about sites of organizing as in a way that goes beyond the kind of traditional workplace setting. There's a couple examples, and then you. Oh, go ahead.
There are many ways that the working conditions that you've described are unique to this group, but as I was listening to you, I was thinking that there are a lot of other places where workplaces are becoming more and more precarious for workers. The gig economy, UPS drivers, I don't know, I can't name them all, but more and more working conditions in general are resembling some of the worst working conditions, such as those that you've described for these precarious workers. So is there any way that you're thinking about the techniques and the strategies that you're developing with this particular group and expanding it into something larger to think about workplace conditions, unionizing, and all of those other issues in a more general way?
Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right. These experiences of precarity are constantly expanding to new industries and workers. And I'm sure there are plenty of people in the audience who've also experienced different forms of them in different types of work, including academia. I would say, so the workers themselves that are involved in these programs, they certainly feel that this structure and this approach is something that should be expanded to other industries. And it does exist in other places. And I think that the part of what's important about these programs is that they're really tailored and they're designed with workers. And so that kind of collaborative design has meant that they're really tailored to the particular ways that workers experience their barriers and their needs. But that the general approach also is actually, I think, importantly, is generalizable to other industries. And so I even I heard from someone from a construction union in, I think in Denver it was, that the ways that they've started to use training as a way to kind of be able to connect. They're working with worker organizations, the union, with these worker centers to be able to connect with workers who are more immigrant workers who are more precarious, and to be able to use training as an entry point to kind of connect them with even the idea of engaging with the union, right? And so I think this way of combining, whether it's like workforce development or addressing a particular issue that workers face, combining that with rights, workers' rights, and organizing training, and that kind of popular education approach that is really meant to seed workers to take action. And I think that combination is really important to learn from. And sometimes I think we see in certain industries this idea that if we are looking at a workforce development approach or something, or what's seen as like a sort of service provision approach, that's not radical, and that we should sort of move away from that because it's this service model, and it's not fomenting a radical approach to organizing. And I think what these programs show is that actually, like, if you are able to think strategically about how to combine those, it can be both offering a form of security to workers, but also it can really become that pathway that actually does allow them to engage in organizing.
Really great talk. I've just a couple brief questions. One, you were talking about the barriers to protection, and I was wondering. You mentioned that employers sort of obfuscate and create these sort of opaque pathways to grappling with the precarity. But I wonder to what degree you see this operating at the state and the federal level, and just sort of thinking about in the aftermath of Reagan's entry into this entire conversation with the strikers in the early 80s. I wonder how this is sort of manifesting itself at the state and federal level, and to what degree does do these organizations that you're writing about, how do they engage with that beyond what's happening at the employer level? Is there any discussion about the extent to which this is a sort of state and federal problem? And then just to piggyback off the last two questions, in these popular education programs, is there any explicit discussion of gender and how gender is shaping these women's lives, at the level of their employers, and it's sort of broadly within the fields that they're working in?
Thank you. Yeah, I'll take the last one first. Absolutely, that because the workers in these programs are predominantly women, although I will say that for the Promotora program, for the janitors, they also have a Compadre program for men who want to be allies. And so that's also, I interviewed and spoke with some men in that program as well. The gender is inescapable, right? Whether it's for janitors who experience gendered sexual violence, or the fact that they're in industries that are predominantly like the nail salon workers and domestic workers, where it's almost entirely women, and also that these spaces that are also spaces where they're able to speak about the particular experience as women in the workplace, but also the ways that the gendered experience of unpaid care work and the pressures that they experience, it becomes, I talked about this trust building. These spaces become a place where workers are really able to speak about the ways that they're gendered, the ways that their racial and ethnic identities and their immigration status, all of this, that it shapes how they experience all of this. And so I think that's a really critical part of why workers are able to feel like that kind of bridge to being able to be involved in like broader spaces of action. And to your first question, and so did I understand it correctly? Are you sort of wondering to what extent are they speaking about kind of anti-union and anti-worker
just
currents
beyond,
more broadly.
Yeah, just beyond the employer, it seems pretty clear. But is there an addressing of like what's happening at the state and federal level to facilitate this opacity? These barriers to grappling with their working conditions.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think it's there in some ways, and one of the things I'll name also is that because these are mostly immigrant workers, people are coming in with actually like a wide variety of experiences of what it means to be part of a union or to be part of organizing, and really different. So for some people, they might have for some people coming from Latin American countries, sort of more of a baseline like. Yes, the union is power. Of course, this is something that we can be involved in. But people also might have experiences of it being dangerous to be involved in things like this, right? So people are bringing quite a range of experiences, and that mixes with what they're seeing and experiencing here in the U.S., right? But I think that one of the ways in which it does a little bit what you're speaking to is that in becoming part of a collective, and they move from seeing this as like an individual problem that they're experiencing in their workplace to seeing it in a more systemic way. And they're dealing with different contexts. So with the domestic workers, they're learning that domestic workers were excluded in the 1930s from minimal federal protections, right, in a racialized exclusion. And they're learning that the only reason they have these very minimal protections are because of a state-by-state process of organizations moving to pass the Domestic Worker Bill of Rights. And so they're also in that curriculum, they're situating themselves within a history of domestic worker organizers, and they're understanding that sort of the ways in which their particular positions and identities are shaping that, and how that slots in at the kind of larger level. Yeah, thank you.
Hi. Okay, so I've been doing some research on different healthcare roles in Arizona recently, and I came across community health workers and promotoras in that context. So it was really interesting for me to hear about this kind of framed differently, because my understanding of community health workers is people who are probably employed by groups like Indian Health Services, who are community members who are seeking to help people with individual healthcare needs. So the kind of psychological aspect is new, the mental health care, and the fact that we're bringing worker organizing into it, I think is really interesting. I'm wondering though, two things. First, how are the promotoras being employed? Is this a volunteer role? Is this a paid position? And with that, how are we connecting promotoras to workers? Because I understand how we kind of are getting people to work as promotoras, but how are we making those connections if maybe there is not a paid way to do this? You know what I mean?
Yeah. Great question. And so, yes, the promotora or community health worker model comes out of a public health approach and has more often been used for addressing health issues that aren't mental health. But there are some other examples of it being used to address mental health approaches, which are fewer. But I will also just say that the way that this was created was because the union and MCTF recognized that this was not their area of expertise, and so they partnered with anti-violence organizations in California that were more familiar with the promotora approach, and they decided to create this version of it and this kind of new form of a promotora model that was rooted in the workplace. So you're right that this is, it kind of exists in this other realm usually, and moving it to a worker model was an important move in this case. So the workers, yes, I don't know the exact details of the payment structure right now, and I think it's different now because there's the people who are actually being paid to go deliver a training at a workplace, which is a paid job, right? Now that the ones who are doing it for the to fulfill the legal requirement for a workplace to have sexual harassment training. So that's something that a worker is then going to be paid for their time to go deliver that. But also the union and MCTF were very conscious of low-wage workers' time and the need to basically support that if they're be able to kind of participate in things like this and deliver trainings or participate in these kinds of spaces, that there would need to be some kind of compensation also. But the way that workers are connected, the promotores are connected to other workers. So one is this kind of more formalized training structure that now exists, where they're going into workplaces to deliver a training. But the other is more as this kind of, that's maybe a little bit more akin to the community health worker approach of just being a resource to workers, to coworkers in the industry. And as I said, right, this is, they're working spread out across buildings, so it's not as though they're kind of in this centralized workplace where there's 40 workers in one place, right? Their access to other workers is mixed, and they're kind of moving around, and so that. But they certainly, that's the sort of primary or the initial way that they're acting as promotores is in being a resource and connecting their coworkers at the work sites.
Is it like a business of people who represent the promotores and like provide the trainings and stuff, and then like you go from there? Because I mean, the businesses aren't going to hire people who are going to help people organize underneath them, you know?
Well, actually, so this is what this new law was quite a big deal because, so the union and allies over the years advocated to pass legislation to increase protections in the janitorial industry. And one of the things that was passed as part of this was a requirement for having sexual harassment training at janitorial services contractors, and also other things that made it harder for these businesses to like fly under the radar and commit violations. But then they subsequently passed another law that requires that training to be delivered to workers by approved peer educators. And the union created a center that trains workers according to what's needed. So it actually is, and the curriculum that is developed by colleagues at labor centers in California in collaboration with workers and with the union. And so they actually managed to pass legislation that does entrench the peer educators, the janitors, as having access to workers in these workplaces. So that was, and that because of the pandemic got delayed in the implementation, so it's just starting to be implemented this year, that level of it. But that was a way that they were able to actually really formalize that access.
Hi. I have thoughts and I think a question. So first, on the thoughts, as you were going through the presentation, the thing I couldn't get out of my mind is everything old is new again. And what I mean by that is a lot of the things that people are doing sound like what has taken place with, for example, organizing home care providers, which is something that I participated in for many years, and also in organizing farm workers. And even if we can get out of our mind this idea of what the traditional labor movement is in a modern context and look at what the traditional labor movement is, like where it started and how it formed, a lot of this stuff is what it was really about. And, you know, I think with that in mind, the thing I can't get out of my head is we've done this many times, and somehow we get to a point and we fail. And it seems like that so often happens with figuring out some shortcuts and some tricks to organizing, where we find a way, for example, with home care workers to get a contract, to create a public authority in California that we can negotiate with, where we don't actually have to talk to all of the workers anymore, and we can get wages and benefits and, you know, all of these things that improve their lives, but now we're doing that with a small percentage of the overall workforce. And so we've maximized for efficiency, but not effectiveness. And so even where we might be able to, or these groups might be able to, through this initial work, create a cadre of people who can create change, create awareness, and then create policy that meaningfully impacts people. Is there any conversation happening amongst them about how to avoid the pitfalls of history? And how to make sure that as they build this thing and scale it, that it continues to be about effectiveness and individual empowerment over the ability to collectively win alone. And I've got other things, but that's one of the things on my mind.
Yeah, thank you. Yes, everything old is new again. I think that in these spaces where they certainly are, there's a lot of people in these spaces, the workers and the organizers, thinking about what does it look like to replicate this and to scale this. And doing that too, right? The We Rise Nanny training is scaling to other states as we speak. And I think that a couple of things. This kind of approach, and I don't think I emphasize this enough in my presentation, but it is really labor intensive, right? It requires so much and for the worker centers, they're very resource strapped. And so it requires such an enormous effort on the part of the workers, the worker organizers. A lot of the way that the We Rise program gets coordinated is through captains who are either worker trainers or worker leaders who've moved into a role of like coordination with the worker center they're part of, and then the staff of the worker center as well. But I've been working really closely with them over the past year to do this research, and it requires an enormous level of commitment. And so the tensions you're talking about, right, we always come up against this, right? The tension between the kind of maybe scaled solutions that will get a contract across, or that will get a policy that affects a really wide group. But it comes back also a little bit to what I said in the beginning, which is that whether it's the Domestic Worker Bill of Rights passing, or with the nail salon workers, they're pushing to pass legislation for a sectoral approach to in the sectoral bargaining approach in the industry. But we have already seen some legislation passed in that industry, specifically in New York. And that reality that it doesn't actually, the rights aren't real until the workers themselves are able to enforce and like uplift and or be organized. And so I think that's where we see that tension at play, right? That it is important to lift the floor, and actually, in interviews and focus groups, it is important to workers to know that they have rights on paper. But then this other piece of, what does it mean for workers to be connected to a collective and to be connected into organizing, to actually feel able, and to even, whether it's being aware of it or feel able to enact those rights, like that tension between the scale and the labor and the commitment that's required there. I don't think there's an easy answer to that, but I guess my impression from working with the people who create these programs and drive these programs is that it requires just an enormous amount of them being dedicated to pushing for the value of it. And the workers who become trainers, who become promotores, are a really important part in like pushing for that. But yeah, I don't have an easy answer for how do we get this approach to be supported, the depth of this approach to be supported more broadly. But I will say that part of why I also do research on it is to understand and to be able to share more broadly the impact that I think these kinds of programs have.
Thanks a lot. This is really excellent research to hear about. I have two quick questions, one organizing related and one more methodological. The organizing question is, how much, or is there any discussion that you hear around cross-industry structures of solidarity around the sorts of things that all precarious workers face? For example, like sexual harassment, not all, but many precarious workers face. And the more methodological question, thinking about the workshop this afternoon, obviously is on my mind, hearing about this research. I'm curious if you as a researcher feel that there's any difference in the way workers relate to you in the organizations that you work with who have these trust building processes, these structures of solidarity they're actively working on, versus organizations that do less of that work. Like, is there any difference in the way people relate to you?
Yeah. So for the first question, so actually this past June, we organized a convening at the Worker Institute at Cornell on the future of care work called Taking Care of Care Workers. And we made it a space that was bringing in both, bringing in people from unions, worker organizations, academics, policy people, all into one space and they were mostly in the areas of domestic work, home care workers, and healthcare workers as the main people that were there. And it was really interesting and amazing to see that, because, right, this category of care work, like, is it actually meaningful to people who are in the positions? And so, for example, for the domestic workers and the home care workers to be in a space, like, hearing about each other's experiences and recognizing the similarities and also the distinctions, but and hearing their experiences validated in that sort of cross-industry space, I think seemed really important to people. But I'll also say that even within an industry, one of the things that I think is interesting in these programs also, say with like the domestic workers in New York, is also bridging across different languages, and ethnic and racial backgrounds. So, for example, like, because the training is done in 3 languages at different organizations, you have the reality is that organizing in industries where there are different languages and different backgrounds is that often also takes trust building and even just commitment to language justice, for example, to create spaces where workers can even communicate with each other. So the trainings, just to be clear, are done separately in languages, but then the spaces where there is, they're bringing together people involved in the program for organizing or advocacy activities or training or to become trainers, also creates those bridges across the industry in a way that I think is important in order for to create kind of a stronger organized sense across the industry. And the same with nail salon workers, right? This is also, in New York, is a particularly diverse and multilingual space. And so we did focus groups in Spanish, Mandarin, Vietnamese, and Nepali. And so really also paying attention to the ways like these programs can potentially bridge solidarity among groups within an industry that have been separate. And to your second question, yes. So this is something that came up in the nail salon research. In the focus groups, we did that because, again, we were working closely with, so it was a participatory research design and collaborative. I trained organizers to be focus group facilitators. And there was definitely a difference between the workers who had participated in training and organizing spaces with worker centers and what they felt able to share versus workers who had not. And we even had to change the structure. Like, for example, with Mandarin-speaking workers, we did just pairs instead of larger focus groups because there was not an organization that was organizing workers and they did not often feel comfortable speaking in front of other workers. And so we changed the design to adapt to that, to just talk to workers either one-on-one or in pairs, recognizing that especially, and it was pretty visible in the way also workers talked about conditions as either, describing similar conditions exploitation and abuses, but then whether they felt like, well, this is just the way it is and that what I have to put up with, versus identifying it as something that was unjust. But also just in workers being able to even share. Like, as I said, speaking about things like wage theft or something like that is also difficult for a lot of workers who are in precarious positions. And so that certainly has come through in the research design.
Thank you for the talk. I have a strangely big picture, small picture question, which I think you were hinting at a little bit in this response right here. But what I want to think about, based on the sort of series that this talk is part of, one thing we're interested in is the way people articulate their aspirations, the cultural resources they use to articulate those. You talked a bit in terms of structures of solidarity. Like, I would also be interested in sort of what the content of solidarity looks like for people. You talked a little bit about how the labor process produces particular forms of silencing in this industry. And, a lot of the picture we'd sort of assume from Saskia Sassen first writing about it in 1991. It's a lot of proletarianization going on, right? There's a real devaluing of the individual worker, putting them in precarious situations, paying them minimally, taking advantage of their marginal position, so on like that. But I'm curious about how, a lot of what you're setting up here is a way of doing research and engaging with workers and having them talk to each other, which has a tremendous value in terms of being able to connect with lots of different kinds of particular interpretations that people might have of their work, the kind of cultural resources they use to interpret it. And I understand that the education program is designed to help provide those as well. But I'm wondering how much you have to sort of translate where workers are into that to make it work, or does it just come very naturally? What kind of resources are workers using to interpret this, or is it very straightforward? Are there conflicts within the group about what matters and what doesn't? So on like that.
Yeah, thank you for that. I think, I think what's important to say is that I don't want to give the impression that it's like everyone goes through this program and then they're like, yeah, I'm ready to take collective action, right? That actually it's really complex, and part of what we're trying to understand in, say, our year-long evaluation of the nanny training program is also like what further support is needed. And so in the interviews with workers earlier after they took the training, and then now like a year later after they took the training, you see quite a wide range of the extent to which they feel able to kind of enact. A lot of workers talk about that kind of transition that I spoke to about before, thinking like, okay, I just have to accept what's offered, or I don't feel able to speak, and to feeling able to speak and feeling able to kind of assert their value and demands. But it's also quite complex because they are dealing with all the experiences of precarity, right? That the kind of demands in the realm of social reproduction that I talked about are still constantly a challenge for workers to be involved in organizing, and but also I was interviewing a nanny recently, and she is a live-in nanny, and so she was in her workplace when I was interviewing her, and 20 minutes in, the employer unexpectedly arrived home, and so. And she kind of signaled something to me, and I said, why don't we finish the interview later? And she called me a day or two later, and she had decided to go home that evening. Usually she sleeps at the employer's during the week, but she decided to go home that evening and see her son and do the interview in her own home. And it was such a dramatically different tone of the way that she talked about her conditions, and it was clear she's someone who has been changed by participating in the training and becoming part of this collective of domestic workers, and that you see that change in the way she talks about it, but that she's really also struggling with that tension of how to apply it and how to kind of find that balance between holding on to that stability that she has and saying and drawing a boundary and saying like, no, I'm not going to put up with this. And so the interview becomes also sometimes for workers like, a space where they're, I almost want to say a space of agitation, right? That where they are actually really kind of starting to be able to reflect honestly on why the conditions are unjust. And I think that it's in that way it can be like a little bit of a connection to the spaces of peer education and things like that, or the spaces of organizing that the approach to participating in the research, or when it's a focus group, the workers often also see it as like connected to organizing, because it's a collective of workers talking about their conditions. So I'm not sure if that quite answers your question.
Well, let me
but
follow up one time.
Yeah.
I'll limit myself to once. Yeah, I mean, so it's a line that I'll borrow from another research site, but there's a basic question which I would ask, which is, what does justice look like for domestic workers in New York that you're organizing? What does that actually look like?
So there's a lot of ways to answer that, right? I think that the processes of organizing and of being in these peer education spaces, these structures of solidarity, is part of a collective process of figuring out like what is justice, right, and what would be just. So in New York, I think also in thinking about these things as part of a larger toolbox, also part of what some of the organizations, one in particular in New York, have been experimenting with is also creating neighborhood-based standards boards as a kind of informal version of the standards board or wage boards that we have seen in other contexts. But as a way to kind of, they're seeing as, one way to explore more of a structure of collective organizing. And so they have organizing employers of domestic workers and organizing domestic workers and kind of establishing higher minimum standards on a neighborhood basis. And what's interesting is I interviewed a nanny a couple weeks ago who had just done an interview for a new job, or had gone through the process of interviewing for a new job for the first time in 13 years. And she said to me, it's so different in these neighborhoods than it used to be. She said the vast majority of the jobs I interviewed for, the parents would send me, these are the benefits we're offering, this is the wage we're offering, and there's this kind of baseline expectation of like a certain benefits that no one ever talked about when she last interviewed. And these are neighborhoods where this organizing is happening, right? And they're also, of course, there's also the kind of socioeconomic realities of different neighborhoods where people are employed affects that. But you have a situation, for example, where paid vacation and paid sick days become like a standard in that neighborhood, so that it's not actually just dependent on the individual worker to say to their employer, I would like this, and the employer to be like, no. If it becomes a norm in that area. And so I think that's one example of the ways that they're trying to kind of create this collective mode of like what it looks like to actually lift standards in a more collective way that isn't fully dependent on the individual worker negotiating. But I think that there's also bigger questions, right? And the kind of the way that workers in these industries, right, that they're, you have a domestic worker who migrates to this country and then has to leave their child in the care of someone else so that they can be paid and in the care of someone else or in their home country, right? So that they can be paid to care for someone else's children. And the injustice of that reality of like global hierarchies and global structures of inequality. And so I think there's a lot of layers to what is just for these workers.
Well, that's the end of our time. So, Michael, can you give some closing remarks or anything? No more follow-ups.
No more follow-ups. Did I already break the time? Please join me in thanking Dr. West for a terrific talk. We're glad to have you here. Thank you all for coming today. This will also be posted on our website in a few days. If other people want to see it that you know, you can point them in that direction. And of course, many of us are here for the Moral Economy Workshop this afternoon. We're going to go to lunch at Ingrained, and then we will convene back here at 1:30 to continue that conversation with some of the benefit of Zoe's wisdom. And also, Ben Tracy from Healthcare Rising Arizona is going to kick us off. He has a few words for us about the Abortion Rights Ballot Initiative, correct? And I think that he is going to let us know a little bit about the state of that effort, and also he has a couple of things to ask of us. So please come back for that then, and I'll see you at lunch or in a little while. Thanks.